Good afternoon, and welcome to our Thomas and Collier book study synchronous session for book number 1. Today is Tuesday, October 29th, and we're here to talk about Chapter 4 in Educating English Learners for a Transformed World. Today's agenda includes our welcome and overview, and then we're going to have a reflection and discussion specifically on Module 6, which is on Chapter 4, of course, understanding the how long question, the PRISM model. We'll also have wrap up and next steps. I apologize for the numbering situation on this particular slide. We seem to be having some technical difficulties today. I am Anne-Marie Gunter, the World Languages Consultant for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and I am actually working solo today as Ivana Manthrow-Anderson, my colleague in ESL and Title III, is away at a conference representing our state. Please also know that that means I may be a little slower to unmute folks or to answer questions because I am working alone behind the scenes, but I will get to everything as best I can. Just to make sure everything is going smoothly on your end, this is the slide that reminds us about our control panel. Remember that the default audio is computer audio. You see it there on the control panel, and your control panel should look similar to the one you see on the screen. If you're ever having trouble with your computer audio, you can switch to phone call and then back to computer audio, and that will reset your audio. You can also unplug and replug your headset, and that will do approximately the same thing. If you're joining us by phone, welcome that way as well. We can usually see you and everything gets recorded well, but let me know if you have any problems. We use the hand icon to indicate you have audio. So let's stop and do a quick sound check. If you have audio, please go ahead and raise your electronic hand from your control panel to let me know that you can hear me broadcasting and that I'm coming through loud and clear for everyone. Excellent. Thank you for doing that. Also, we have the questions box, as you know. And the questions box can be used at any time to ask questions about technology or individual things. I may also use it to send out group announcements or links. That's a good place too to record what you want to say. We are working more and more towards having people be unmuted, so raising their electronic hand and them being unmuted and share what they want to. But you're always welcome to put something in the questions box so that I see your hand up as well that way too. That helps me make sure I'm getting to everyone who has something to share. The recording of this meeting will be posted approximately 1 week from today. We always give that 1 week guarantee in any broadcast we do. I think everyone knows, though, we try to get them posted much more quickly than that, especially at something like this with a book study, because we do have some people who can't join us during the live broadcast, and they'll need to listen to this recording and do the makeup assignment. So we get it posted as soon as we can. All right. Let's talk a little bit about where we are in the book study. Here is our timeline. You've seen this before. You know that we have our synchronous sessions over the course of these 2 months, October and November, on Tuesdays from 4 to 5:30. We are now going to be more than halfway through as of today, because October 29th is our last one in October, and then we have 2 coming up in November. We did not meet, as you know, last week on Tuesday, October 22nd, as a time for everyone to kind of get caught up on assignments and postings and take a bit of a break from our weekly meetings. So we are back on track now, and we will finish out on November 12th. All right, Chapter 4, as you know, is understanding the how long question, and it focuses specifically on the PRISM model. I know you read a good deal about that. Maybe that's something you were familiar with before, or maybe it was new to you. And so I hope you enjoyed reading about that and thinking through the implications for your English learners and for other students that you encounter as well. Remember that I'd like for you to put your responses in the questions box or raise your electronic hand to be unmuted and share your ideas as we go through the questions and things today. As I said, it's really helpful to me if you put at least a partial response in the questions box, because that lets me know that in fact your raised hand means you want to be unmuted and you have something to share. We've had some technical difficulties, and sometimes the go-to system will raise hands sort of accidentally. So that's the good check on us, is to use the questions box so that we know. All right, first thing we do, as you know, is do a bit of a poll question. So in this one, it's a sort of complete the sentence, and you get to check all that apply. So for the PRISM model, does it apply to ELs and native English speakers? Does it help predict factors that close achievement gaps? Does it have 4 major components? Was it developed to help legislators? And should it be looked at as a 3D model? I'll go ahead and run that poll question, and as you know, you can click on the responses that are right for you. And again, this is a check all that apply. All right. It looks like almost everyone has responded. Do keep in mind, participation in the polls is something that is part of your grade when you attend the synchronous sessions. So be sure you get your responses in on our poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out so that we can see what everyone said. All right, let's take a look at our responses. A vast majority of you, over 80%, said that the PRISM model does have 4 major components, and that's very true. We're going to talk about those in depth, and I hope you've looked at each one individually, as well as how they work together to think about our discussions for today. Also, over 80% of you said the PRISM model helps predict factors that close the achievement gap, which is very true. And the PRISM model applies to English learners or ELs and native English speakers. That is true because it talks about L1 and L2 development, or language 1 and language 2 development. About 2/3 of you said that the PRISM model should be looked at as a 3D model. And that's true too, because it does look at 2 different languages. And so the authors talked briefly about thinking of it as a 3D model and how that changes your visualization of this when you think about it in 3D as opposed to 2D. And just over a quarter of you, 29%, said that the PRISM model was developed to help legislators. Well, that could be true. It was certainly developed to help a lot of stakeholders conceptualize the challenges that English learners face when they're trying to learn a language that they're receiving instruction in. And so that PRISM model could certainly be used with legislators to help them look at that, but also other stakeholders, policymakers, other educators, parents, or whoever would be important to help educate them about the needs of English learners. All right. So before we begin our discussion here, another thing we want to think about is how our NISA standards, our North Carolina Educational Evaluation Standards, or NISA standards, how those look through the English Learner and DLI lenses as we work through this book study. You see the 5 different standards that teachers are evaluated there on the screen with. And one thing we want to ask you today is, what do you see differently on these standards? And we'll talk about why in a minute, but what do you see differently now that you've read about the NISA standards and you're thinking about the reading you're doing in this book study? So I'll run a quick poll on which of these standards you feel you see differently before we begin our discussion. And this is a check all that apply. So consider standard 1 of leadership, standard 2 about the establishing a respectful environment for diverse populations, standard 3 content knowledge, standard 4 facilitating learning, and standard 5 reflection. Take a moment and think that through. All right, finish getting your responses in about which of the NISA standards you see differently now that you've been reading, particularly chapter 4. All right, everyone has voted. Thank you so much. And I'll share the responses here. Notice that the majority of you see certainly standard 2 differently now about creating a respectful environment for diverse populations of students. And almost the same number also said they see standard 4 about facilitating learning for students quite differently. Just under half of you said you now see standard 1 about leadership differently, and the same number said you see standard 5 about reflection differently. Also, almost 40% of you said you now see standard 3 differently regarding content knowledge. It's an interesting result, and I think we should pause there for a minute and look at that. I'm going to ask you to share why you see those differently here in a minute. And what I want you to do, so that I know who to call on, is if you have something to share for the standard that I call off, I want you to enter that standard number in the questions box and just briefly note the things you see differently now that you've read the book. So I like beginning with the majority, because I know we'll find the most comments there. So for those of you who indicated that standard 2, creating a respectful environment for diverse populations, is something you now see differently, go ahead and type in the question box a 2, and then briefly how you see that standard differently now that you're reading the book. Oh, and it looks like I need to take us off of viewing that in order for you to do that. Sorry about that. Go ahead then. If you've got something to share about how you see standard 2 differently, make a quick note about it in the questions box and I can unmute you. Rachel, I see that you have something to share. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can talk out.
Well, hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Perfect. I had said that as an ESL teacher, I've always known that assignments and content would need to be tweaked for ELLs and adjusted so that content will be reachable for them. As far as it goes, you know, every teacher has a lot of diverse students in their classroom, whether they be ELLs or special needs or academically gifted. So you're always trying to kind of reach that balance where you're meeting all the needs of the diverse kids in your class.
It's very true. I also see that Marcella has something to share, so I'll unmute her. Go ahead, Marcel.
Hi, can you hear me? I hope you can.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if I had the right answer to the right question. What I did wrote on the answers was that after reading the chapter and thinking more about the student as a whole, not just as a person who is here to learn, and that we must learn about them as well and take this information into account to teach them better.
Yes, very true. Emily, I see you have something to say about Standard 2, and actually this is Emily Golightly. We have a couple of Emilys on the line. So Emily, I've unmuted you. Please go ahead and share.
Hey, so I was just noticing in the reading that importance of the L1 and L2 instruction, and so that was something that really jumped out for me because our district really doesn't have any bilingual programs yet, which is why I participated in the book study. And one of my concerns that I've seen is that there's still some of that thinking in the regular classroom of, well, they shouldn't be speaking in their L1, they need to speak English, I don't know what they're saying. And so I had some concerns about that because that's something we're still grappling with, even just at the basic speaking level, let alone making them literate and, you know, able to read and write in L1 and L2.
That's a really good point, and we want to make sure that our students are free to speak in the language that's most comfortable for them in any given context. Of course, we want them to be using both languages and practicing both languages they're learning, but there's no need to restrict or limit students as to what language they can speak when. It's important to model when they can use each language and when you encourage them to practice each language, but we don't want to punish them in any way or make them feel bad about the language choice that they make. Melissa, I see you have something to say. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. There you go. Go ahead, Melissa. Oh, I think we may be having some technical problems there. All right, let's go on to Claire. She's got something to share. Claire, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great, I was worried about my connection here. Yeah, I'm an ESL teacher, so this has been something that I've thought of for many years, but I know that when I first considered this and learned about English language learners, that looking at all their different cultural backgrounds and what that entails, their language, the culture of their language, and respecting that and encouraging the culture of their language, while at the same time trying to, in the ESL classroom, then we're trying to teach them English there. I think that with us, we have a bilingual program in our school, and not all the classes are bilingual. We just have 6 classes that do that, and our students that are in the bilingual classrooms really benefit from being able to learn the material in both languages and get a better concept of it. So I'll often use Spanish when teaching them because our dual language program is in Spanish, and I'll flip back and forth between both languages.
Yes, it's always an interesting question how we decide the language instruction. Of course, in a DLI program, the languages are kept separate and reserved for particular types of instruction based on the schedule that everyone has. But when we think about ESL classes and other times when students are with us, we need to think about the language support we can give them and how that will benefit them.
Exactly.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Allison. She's got something to share. Go ahead, Allison, you're unmuted.
Well, for me, we always think about cultural when we're planning our lessons in regards of their background knowledge. But as an ESL teacher and as a science middle school teacher, then you have the other aspect. For example, if you have students that are from Arabic culture and girls are not supposed to interact with boys and boys are not supposed to interact with girls. So thinking about that diversity beyond just the academics, when you plan your your homework, when you are planning your activities and your interactions in the classroom. That's always important.
Yes, it definitely is. And we have to balance our approach to that when we know things about cultures like how boys and girls are to interact. It is a delicate situation sometimes, and we need to be
Yes.
sensitive to that, but also encourage our students to do the learning they need to do.
Mhm. Yes.
Great. Kimberly, you got something to share? I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead. Looks like you're self-muted, so I've unmuted you on this end. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and talk. It looks like she may be having some tech problems. One of the things that Kimberly has said in the question box is that many administrators are not trained in SIOP or other areas of special needs. It's equally difficult to become a teacher leader in this area due to the restrictions of some administrators' knowledge about language acquisition. And that's certainly something to consider when we're thinking about Standard 2, as well as things like Standard 1 and Standard 3 even. We want to think about what our administrators know and how we educate them on what the needs of our students are and what we mean by a respectful environment for a diverse learners, as well as what leadership in the field looks like. So it's a very good point, Kimberly. All right, Joanna, you've got several things you want to say about Standard 2. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can do that. There you go. All right. Joanna says she doesn't have a microphone, so I'll share what she's typed in here. She said for Standard 2, she is thinking about the amount of work that English learners must do each year in order to close the gap. And that's really given her new respect for the challenges that face linguistically diverse students and the challenges that teachers face in setting up a respectful environment for diverse populations like linguistically diverse students. It's a good point, and sometimes that kind of reflection or perspective really helps us as educators. And she says she is committed as well to making sure she fosters and promotes a sense of respect to all students in her classes. All right. Looks like Jesus has some things to share. I will unmute him so he can share. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I just made a comment that says that the reality is that the environment is not ready to truly fulfill a respectful environment that the standard refers about. And that I hope to be able to see the day when this great goal can be really observed. Um, there are several things. I ask myself the question: how long? How long will it take for us to understand that we have these great people working and researching and doing these many findings? And when is it that we are going to use this and for the good of the children?
Well, and I think that's a question we all face, and we all know that we have, hopefully in our own classrooms, established that respectful learning environment and that we're modeling that for others. But there are always challenges with that. And I think that gets to some of our other standards, including Standard 1 of leadership. How do we model that for others and really be a leader in our work with students to other educators? And also, Standard 4, where we talk about facilitating learning for all students. So with that, I'm going to ask us to kind of switch over to those two standards, Standard 1 and Standard 4, to talk more about this question and how it impacts our work based on our reading. So again, just enter in if you have something to share about Standard 1 or Standard 4, or maybe both together, and think about Jesus's question as well. I will go ahead and share something that came up in the question box. Sandra is with us today, but she cannot speak out because she's involved in a meeting. So she's apparently monitoring our work as she also attends to the meeting. She says that she does believe there's that the greatest way to have a respectful environment, like we talk about in Standard 2, as well as Standard 4, and to some degree Standard 1 with leadership, is that all educational stakeholders give a status to the primary language of our English learners, whatever that language is. And then that our schools are progressing towards a bilingual model. She says educators can certainly acknowledge the existence of all the languages in their school setting and think about that and how students bring bilingual assets to the learning environment. And that's a good point to consider. If we just view it differently, sometimes that changes our perspective enough for us to get a new respect for students and the work that they're doing. All right, I see Carlos has a comment about Standard 1. Carlos, I'm going to unmute you.
Hey, well, I think that sometimes as I was writing, we tend to be leaders within our small world, our small ESL world, with our kids, our children, and also with our colleagues. But I think that we can definitely do more. And the more I read the book, because when I read chapter 4, I moved on to chapter 5 and chapter 6 right away, because it's very interesting. All the information is really, it's touching, because I don't feel that I am doing my job as a leader, except for that, just being a leader for my students and my colleagues within the classroom and the other classrooms somehow. But I had never thought about, sharing these new ideas that I'm learning now, for example, with the principal, to see if we can find some other ways to reach these students, and probably this principal can be also a leader. And, when I talk to him about this, he can share it with other principals, and probably goes to other levels, and probably can have a program that is a little bit more align school to school. For instance, I have a new student that came from another school within the county, and she says that she's kind of totally lost because we are not following the same things, even the program over there is very different to the one I'm running. So, that it's really interesting.
Definitely. And being a leader in our own classrooms is certainly where we start with that. So don't feel bad. If you think you can do more, you're always doing a lot just by doing that. And then you can branch out, as you said, and really have more of an impact when you're ready.
Yeah.
All right. I'm looking down through. Gabriella has something to share, and she says for her, Standards 1 and 4 go together. So Gabriella, I will unmute you so that you can share.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, so I feel like in order to facilitate learning, we also have to have the support and the tools necessary that come from our leaders. I feel very fortunate because at my school, I feel I do have that support, and the principal is aware of the need for providing more tools, for getting teachers more involved, for students to take more accountability of their learning. And I'm also seeing that need for parents to be more involved, and how important it is for parents to be part of the process of teaching the kids and helping them grow and reinforcing their first language, and helping them guide them through the second language acquisition. I did a little training yesterday for an hour with all the classroom teachers, thanks to the principal who allowed me to do it. And I was shocked to, I asked some questions at the beginning, like, what do you guys know about ESL? How does a student become an ESL student? What's the criteria for eligibility? What is the criteria for exiting? And I got some responses that I was really shocked. And the misconceptions of what ESL is, or what our kids need, and what the teacher's role is in their growth. It was very interesting, but I felt like they really liked it. They found it, you know, oh, okay, so I can do this. And I had some emails today like, Abby, what can I do about this? Or can you provide me with some materials? And so I felt that it was a good start. But I think it has to come also from our leaders and from the support that they're going to give us to support those students as well.
Yeah, those are very good points. And you're right. There are times where we actually have to educate our leaders so that they know how they can support us and how they can support the students that we're working with. As educators, we have a lot to do, and that's as true for a teacher as it is for an administrator, of course. And so educating others is important, and that is a way for us to show leadership, but also to get at Standard 4 too, about where we're facilitating learning for all students and helping others to see how best to do that. And I'm seeing a lot of comments from that, from others, Gabriella, on congratulations on doing that, and they're glad you had the opportunity to educate someone like your principal or an administrator to make things more clear about what happens with our English learners in their learning process and in their journey. All right. Anna doesn't have a microphone, but she wants to share that she sees leadership differently in the sense of what she can do as a leader in her classroom and in other classrooms in the school to share the ideas from the book. She especially likes the concept of the PRISM model because it shows the interdependence of the 4 components of that model, which is a good way to help others visualize that too. And nothing is better sometimes than a good visual like this to help explain something to someone and give them something to remember and then reflect on and learn more from it as their understanding grows. So thanks for that, Anna. All right. I see Allison. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead and share out.
Well, as leaders, and when we facilitate for other leaders, for other teachers, and for even administrators, sometimes we assume they know, and then we skip the educating them part. So from this chapter, that was my reflection. That was my takeaway. Don't assume, and always be willing and be brave to take the that first step to educate and bring awareness.
That's good thinking, and you're right. We have to kind of formatively assess our colleagues as well to see what they know already and what we still need to educate them about and what they need to know about different things. I see Marcella also has a comment. Marcella, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I was saying about the leadership, I was talking about leadership not only being the administration, but also the PLC leaders and the coaches, and how important it is for them to be aware of how second language learners learn and how our background, because I consider myself a second language learner, affects and has effects on our learning. If they could see the students through the PRISM model, then they could understand that students, are more than academics and grades. We are people that have, our own set of skills that could help with our learning or the lack of those skills. If they could understand that, then maybe they could help us or help the other teachers help their students learn in different ways.
Yes, that's a good point, and it is critical that we include when we say administrators or leaders, not just the ones in a formal administrative role or with a title with that, but also maybe the more informal ones, people who are teacher leaders or PLC leaders or department heads who have some responsibilities, but we wouldn't necessarily think of them as an administrator per se. Everyone needs to be educated, and we can help with that. All right, well, let's move on then to Standard 3 and Standard 5. There were a few of you on each of those, a pretty substantial number, over a third, who said that you now see Standard 3 about content knowledge or Standard 5 about reflection a little bit differently. So let's pause a moment. What would you like to share about Standard 3 and Standard 5? Go ahead and put your responses in the question box so I know who to unmute. All right, looks like Rachel has something to share about Standard 3. Rachel, I'm unmuting you so that you can do that.
So as far as Standard 3, as far as the content knowledge, one of our important jobs as ESL teachers are to equip the teachers to teach the content to the best of their ability while considering the challenges of the ELLs. For example, building background knowledge, being aware of cultural differences, making the language accessible by having both language and content goals for lessons. So these are things that the teachers are experts in their content area, but knowing how to use strategies to help the ESL kids in their classes, like that's something that's critical, or that I was reminded of while reading this chapter.
And that's a good point. There's a lot that goes into content knowledge above and beyond even what most people think of when we say content knowledge or knowing your subject area. So there's lots of things to think about. And again, that PRISM model probably gives us a good way to really see that in a broader sense. All right. I've got a couple people who don't have microphones, but that's okay. We can share what they've put in the questions box. Catherine said that she wants to say that she now sees content knowledge differently, and that it's important to understand the diverse population in delivering the content knowledge. And delivering content in general. Some of our students may not have the background knowledge, especially in like a social studies or science classroom. And so it's important for us as educators to understand and sort of be mindful of those gaps in knowledge or those places where we can fill in a little bit of information that will help students better understand our content. All right, and I see Emily Golightly has some thoughts on standard number 5 about reflection. Emily, I have unmuted you. Go ahead.
Okay, so this kind of caused me to reflect on my own students and think about those that I know have more exposure to L1 at home. They're working on reading in L1 and L2 and writing in L1 and L2. And I do see where those students are more successful in L2 that have that exposure in L1 at home. And so while, as I stated before, we don't have that bilingual program, I see the impact it has even just from parents who are advocates and who are supporting that L1 at home.
Yes, and that's very true. And there was some from our authors about L1 support coming from home and how we need to value that in the different ways it can happen. So that's certainly important to consider. Marcella has something to share on standard 3, so I'm unmuting her. Go ahead, Marcella, you can unmute. Says you've got yourself muted now. Okay. Well, she seems to be having a few technical problems. That's no issue for us, though. I'll go ahead and share with you that she thought for standard 3 that sometimes teachers think about making content relevant by making it about what the students like. But to her, making content relevant is about making it personal, how it impacts our present or our future, how it creates relationships with the old and the new information that we have. And so that's another way to think about content knowledge. Also have Stephanie who wants to share that as a general education teacher, she loves when ESL teachers share their knowledge with the staff at her school. She says a lot of times they know more about the background that English learner students have that other teachers wouldn't be aware of without them sharing. So that's always very helpful. And by the way, Stephanie says she's a report card pickup right now, so she can't speak up. We always are mindful of what time of year it is. Right now, of course, we're ending first quarter, the first grading period in a lot of our schools, so we do have a lot of conferences and things going on. All right, well, let's move on from this conversation. On to our next part where we talked about connections. And you saw in the module, I hope, that we looked at the TEL project, the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project. And you know, that's an interesting project because it's been around several years now. And in fact, you may have noticed on the website that there's actually a revised version now of TEL materials. The originals came out in 2013 and 2014, But now here in 2019, we're getting some updates and things. So that's good. Something more for us to consider. So one of the questions we had about the TEL project was, first of all, what resources did you discover? But then also, how can you use the TEL framework that's there in your work? So I'll just go out briefly to the website. Give me just a second. But you see here the TEL website, and it looks at professional goals and really gets you to think about, as a teacher, how are you doing certain things in your classroom, particularly as a language instructor. So if we take a look at that framework, I'm just going to click on that on the left-hand side. You see that we have 3 major areas in the TEL project. There's preparing for student learning, there's advancing student learning, and there's supporting student learning. And then that falls out into different areas. Preparing for student learning involves the learning environment, as well as planning. The advancing student learning involves the learning experience overall, and then performance and feedback. And then supporting student learning involves collaboration, professionalism, and then underneath all of it is learning tools. So if we look at that and consider some of the resources, know that as it shows here under each domain, there's domain criteria and a self-assessment tool. And there's domain criteria that's been updated, as I said, in 2019. The self-assessment tools are quite interesting because these are things that teachers can use to reflect, to self-assess, obviously, on their own practice. And we've used them quite extensively since the TEL project became available to all of us nationwide. It was originally put together, by the way, by district coordinators of languages. And so they spent a lot of time creating these tools in order to help teachers improve their language instruction in the classroom, but also to think about the different components of teaching and learning and to become better reflectors. I'm just going to open up the environment one on self-assessment so that you can kind of see, if you haven't already, what's there. This environment one, of course, correlates to our Standard 2 here in North Carolina about a respectful environment for diverse populations. And you can see that there's some main statements and then some sub-criteria that you can assess on. And you're really just looking at whether you do something, you sometimes do it, you do it most of the time, or you do it with confidence. And then you can indicate on these self-assessment tools whether this is something that you want to become a goal for your own professional growth as you reflect. All right, so let's hear about your work with the TEL project and your exploration. What resources did you discover that you thought would be helpful, and how can you use the TEL framework? I'll look for responses to start popping up in the question box so I knew who to call on. Suddenly gone very quiet in the question box. Perhaps you're all thinking. One thing we should add, though, I've gotten several questions behind the scenes, especially when we talk about students' first language, their L1, as well as the language that they're learning. One person was asking about, what languages do we do language immersion? And we do them obviously in 8 different languages. Spanish is our most prevalent, but we have DLI programs in various languages across the state. And those could expand, and we can even add more. We're a local control state, so it's determined by the community's needs what type of program you have. In addition, when we think about L1 and respecting everyone's first language, our language diversity brief that we publish each year based on the home language survey shows that there are over 300 languages spoken in students' homes besides English. And that also speaks to our linguistic diversity across the state and makes us, I think think more deeply about what our students' first language is and how we can incorporate that in what we do. All right, I see Gabriella has something to share about self-assessments. Gabriella, you're just self-mute, so you can go ahead and unmute and share.
I think it's a great tool. I try to do that, and I try to sometimes record myself teaching so I can see what I'm not doing, what I should be doing better, how my students are responding, and it helps me, improve my skill and try to work on certain areas a little bit more. And I think also having a coworker observe you and give you some feedback about your strengths and your weaknesses and how the students are responding to your teaching helps a lot, because I've noticed sometimes you're involved in the lesson and there's some little things going on with the student or with their comprehension that you are not aware of, and they bring it back to you, and it helps improve your teaching and make your class more engaging, and make sure that your students are really learning and they're really understanding, and helps me also assess the progress of my students. Should I go back? Should I reteach this? How is it working for them? Are they really using the vocabulary that I'm expecting for them to use? Is everybody participating? Things like that.
Sounds good. All right, Veronique is also wanting to share some things about the TEL framework and resources that we looked at. Veronique, I am unmuting you so you can talk.
Yeah, well, as I haven't been in the classroom for a while, I was not aware of the TEL project, and I found it quite interesting and actually a little bit overwhelming, because it was the whole website that I discovered, and it was quite amazing, I have to say, because in my days of teaching there was no such thing. And so I browsed and I discovered a little bit of different areas, and I was quite impressed also by the self-assessment sections. And it's quite interesting and certainly quite useful for those who are in the classroom, I think.
Yes, very true. And it is nice that we have all these new resources available to us, and especially ones like the TEL project that are free and that obviously align to things like our state evaluation standards, as well as the kind of thinking we want to do around good pedagogy in the classroom for our state standards. That's one of the benefits, I think, of living in the 21st century with the technology we have. We can link all of that up, and so you can have easy access to things like the TEL project, their self-assessment documents, and so forth, and use them in our work here locally. All right, Christina looks like she has some questions as well. Christina, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. Christina, do you want to go ahead and share?
I was just wondering, in terms of how charter schools fit in with this. I know that the county school that I used to be at, they had like a welcome center. And I should state, I'm not in EL right now. I'm in special ed, and I'm interested in EL, so I'm learning a lot. But they seem to mostly be doing just inclusion now, and not a whole lot of dual language learning. In fact, one of the things that got me interested in EL was that when I was teaching Reg Ed English to 8th graders, I had a student that came over from Colombia, and she had no English, and she was just put into the regular education program with no other language supports. There was an EL teacher that was assigned to her, as well as many other different schools and children, and she came to our school like one time a week. And because of the way her schedule worked out, she wound up in the math teacher's class instead of the English teacher's class. And the math teacher actually spoke Spanish. So I started trying to, get texts that were in Spanish that we were reading So, you know, she would just get the Spanish version of the short story we were reading as a class, because what I was trying to teach was, you know, theme and does she know characterization, and trying to get at those things. And the EL teacher actually admonished me for that and said, you know, that no, we don't do that. We don't do, it's all immersion. We don't do, you know, two different languages. And now everything I'm reading in this book says that that really is the way to go with it. And I'm just kind of wondering, you know, what you mentioned programs in North Carolina, but is this statewide? Are these going to be required again to have dual programs? And where do charter schools fit in that as well? Because I'm currently at a charter.
Okay, well, let's break this question down a little bit, because I think we're piling a lot of things into this discussion, which is good. But let's separate some things out for a moment. The focus of this book, as we know, is English learners, right? So specifically, English learners who most times are in what we would call traditional ESL programs. So these are students who come to our schools as English learners, so they speak a language other than English at home. And in most English learner programs, ESL traditional ones like transitional, bilingual, and whatnot, what you actually see is what's called a subtractive model of bilingualism, where the goal of the program is to get that student to have a higher level of proficiency in English so that they can be in with native English speaking peers in all of their academic classes. It's called subtractive because not a lot of attention is paid to building their skills in their first language, whatever that is. Oftentimes in North Carolina, it's Spanish, but that's certainly not the only language that our English learners come to us with. But it's subtractive because we're really subtracting and making them almost monolingual English speakers because there isn't any focus on their first language. Some of the things you mentioned, I think we need to be careful with terminology. Inclusion is often a term that's used with exceptional children or special needs children, where they are mainstreamed into a classroom, meaning that they are placed in with students who have very different learning abilities than they do, and they receive instruction at the same time, although changes are made based on their individualized education plan, of course. With English learners, sometimes they can be viewed much the same way. And again, that's viewing English learners as having a deficit of some kind because they don't have English, as opposed to looking at them as having an asset of another language that could be developed as well. And as we saw in chapter 4 with the PRISM model, developing their first language will help them not only in building their English proficiency or their L2 proficiency, but will actually help them academically, cognitively, and so on. Now, when we talk about dual language immersion, what we're talking about there is educating students in two languages. Some of our principals call this the 2-for-1 deal, or the BOGO, buy one, get one free, right? And that's an interesting way to think about it. But really what we're doing when we do dual language immersion, what we call DLI, and that kind of immersion, is in fact educating students in two different languages. So we're teaching the standard course of study, we're just teaching it in English and another language. And so students are in what's called an additive bilingualism model there, because in fact, they start with one language, whatever the L1 is, and they're adding an L2. And so for some of our learners, that L2 is English if they're English learners, but for others, that L2 is the DLI program language. And as we noted, that can be so far 8 different languages in North Carolina, depending on where you're at and which program. But DLI is a very different approach, and it is additive bilingualism, where all students in the DLI program are in fact becoming bilingual and biliterate. And so that's a little bit different maybe than what we've seen in the past. Most people who are educators currently probably were never in a school environment where there was a DLI program, though they might have a variety of experience with English learner or ESL programs, depending on where they've been, and to some degree, their age and what was available at the time that they were being educated as a student. So having said all of that, when it comes to our school districts in North Carolina, traditional public school districts and their schools, or our charter schools, of course, all of those schools teach our standard course of study. We are a local control state, which means that when you teach a standard course of study, you have local control over how you do that. So you can choose, for example, to have a DLI program where you're teaching the standard course of study in 2 languages, English and another language, or you can choose a variety of other things. And so the requirements are the same, requirements, if you will, because the only requirement is really that you're teaching the standard course of study. and that you're doing it effectively so students are learning. And that's then measured by a variety of assessments that we've sometimes talked about and that you're probably well familiar with as a teacher. And as far as how widespread is dual language is a quickly growing focus in our state. Our first DLI program in the state ever began in the fall of 1990. I'd like us for all of us to pause for a minute and think about where we were in the fall of 1990. But that was our first program, and it has grown steadily over the years. Most of our DLI programs start with a kindergarten group, a cohort, and then add on their first grade and so on until they build into the middle school and high school. At this point, we have just this year 200 DLI programs across the state, K-12. As you might guess, there are more at the elementary level than at the middle school and high school because, first of all, they have to grow into middle school and high school, and some are still very new programs. But second of all, also, as you know, when you have within a district or a charter school a feeder pattern, there are probably several elementaries that feed into one middle school and again, several middle schools that feed into one high school. So we see fewer DLI programs as students get older simply because they are going into schools together at the secondary level. So there's a lot to think about there. And like I said, we have 200 programs as of this year. We're very proud of that as a state. That's a lot of opportunity. It, of course, was part of our Global Education Task Force commitments over the last 5 years from 2013 to 2019. And then work is continuing on to support those programs. And that's some of what we're doing in this book study is continuing to provide support and educate people about how English learners can be educated. And DLI is one very good option that has a lot of positive impacts for our English learners and incorporates students who are native English speakers as well. All right. Well, having said all that, also you talked about statewide. So right now we have 115 districts in North Carolina. 47 of them have at least one DLI program. Some have multiple programs. We have 7 charter schools that have a DLI program. And again, we're local control, so they can choose to start a DLI program or not. It's up to them. And we have several independent schools as well in our state that have DLI. All right, well, let's jump back into our conversation. Peggy had some things to share about this question. So Peggy, I'm going to unmute you so you can talk with us.
I don't want to talk.
Sorry about that. Peggy just had noted that in her comments that in her school there are very few English learners and all are bilingual. So the comment about inclusion is on point for her school, and that's a really good point to make. We noted before that there's a lot of linguistic diversity in North Carolina, and there are over 300 languages represented in our students' homes besides English. But some of those students come to us not really in need of ESL services because they're already bilingual. And so she says that the teachers that she works with want to keep any English learners they do have in content classes. So she pushes to make sure the kids' needs are being met, of course. And she does very little one-on-one instruction, but hearing all of our discussion today makes her want to maybe add some more one-on-one so that she's attending to the needs of those individual students perhaps a bit better as she's reflecting on that. All right, Claire has some things to share, so I will unmute her. Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I was just commenting that this is my first experience working in a dual language school at the school that I'm in now. And it's interesting to see. I'm used to seeing the English learners treated and taught differently in the classroom when they are the only language learners learning a second language in the class, and they don't always get the same content, and the teachers may not have the teaching strategies to be able to include the language learners. And in the dual language classroom, they just blend right in with all the rest of the student. Everybody's learning a language there. And so the strategies that are used for teaching the classroom are for everyone. And, you know, that's just something to think about, that the strategies that we use, for instance, as ESL teachers or as dual language teachers, are the same strategies that could be applied in a regular classroom.
Yes, that's a good point, because good solid language instruction and providing supports for comprehension are always a positive for students. And that's often what we hear as well from groups like AIG when we talked about gifted and talented students. The things that we bring into their education have benefits for all students, just like we do with how we structure language education. So thank you for that. All right, Sorelda wants to share a little bit. So I'm going to unmute her so she can share. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to share, I'm MEP, Migrant Ed Program, and we do home visits. And during the summer, we were doing some read alouds with our older students. And I asked one of them to translate back into Spanish for her mom, and she couldn't. So she's been immersed so much into the English language, she actually was struggling to come up with words in her first language. So the subtractive model, it does have a lot of negative effect on the students.
Yeah, that's something really important to consider when we think about what the PRISM model says about cognitive development and that L1 support coming from home. If students are actually starting to lose their L1, that can have some real detrimental effects on their education and their development overall. So something really to think about in a deep way for us as educators.
That was all I wanted to share.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're having a great discussion. I am watching our time a little bit. I don't want us to go over, even though I don't want to also interrupt a good discussion. But let's go ahead and roll forward. I think we've talked quite a bit about how we use the PRISM model to think about things. But let's stop for a moment and think about how can you use the PRISM model? And specifically, let's talk about maybe how can you use the PRISM model as an educational tool? Like, what audiences would you use that with? So let's maybe get some concrete examples, maybe share 3 concrete examples. Go ahead and type in the question box if you have a good example of how you can use the PRISM model to educate. Seem to all have fallen silent on that one. I know we talked before about using the PRISM model with administrators or other colleagues to talk about that. And Gabriella wants to share a little bit. So Gabriella, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So for me, it's trying to make sure that all aspects of the PRISM model, all aspects of learning acquisition are happening in the student. Making sure, the academic development is there, but also the social and cultural, aspects of the student. How are they dealing socially, culturally, with their biculturalism? How their L1 is being developed? How parents are getting involved at home? Are those discussions happening? What is the cognitive development that is happening at home, and also what is happening in the school? Because if I've noticed a lot, one of them is missing, and so it's important to meet with the parents, for example, to make sure they're having discussions, they're communicating, they're interacting, there are things happening at home, socially with friends, their interactions. I've noticed, for example, some teachers and some students that we've talked about, students, how, the teacher was telling me, well, I wish she would interact more with English speakers. She's, when she's in recess or with friends, she's only with Spanish speakers, and she doesn't want to socialize with English speakers, and maybe try to participate more in field trips or participate more in activities that have to do with culture. And so making sure that all aspects of it are developing correctly in the students.
It's a good point about using the PRISM model to make sure you're addressing the needs of the whole child, the whole learner. Okay, great. Rachel, looks like she has some comments to share as well. Rachel, go ahead.
Well, I just want to, I guess, piggyback off of what Gabby said as well, because I feel like it would be good to share with colleagues at the high school where I teach, and also with the administrators, so that, like y'all were talking about, you want to teach the whole student who is an ELL, like what different things do you need to incorporate in your classroom, or as even with the school culture, if you're an administrator, to make sure that the child feels welcomed and accepted, and also gets to kind of be the expert, because they oftentimes feel like they're coming into an environment where they lack something because they don't know English, whereas we want to encourage them that they have a lot to offer culturally and socially by their own experiences that they've had that are different from a lot of the kids that they're going to encounter in their regular classes.
Okay, that's a great point. Allison also wanted to share a little bit about using the PRISM model with secondary colleagues. So I'll go ahead and unmute her. Go ahead.
Well, it's good to use with high school teachers and high school, middle school, not only just the teachers, but also the students, because not everybody understands how language acquisition works and why they are making friends, why they're cussing in the cafeteria, and then they cannot answer a test. And then the model, that diagram per se, then shows an explanation as to why, and it can help them, the teachers, understand why the social aspect of the language is developing faster. And then it also helps the student realize, well, these are all the areas you're learning with your English and which way we can go from where they are.
Okay, thank you. All right, I also see Emily Golightly who wants to share. Emily, go ahead. All right, Emily. Oh, it looks like she's having some tech problems. So I'll just go ahead and share a little bit about what she's typed in her question box. She said she would share the PRISM model with administrators, classroom teachers, and even families when discussing the importance of L1 usage and the importance of a continued development through puberty and its impact on academic achievement. And, you know, bringing families into this is a good thing to think about as teachers. Somebody mentioned doing home visits and that kind of thing and being with families, but also families have a lot to give to their students at home. And sometimes they don't realize that, particularly when they're in an English learning environment themselves. And so it's always good to reinforce how important it is that they use the L1 with their children or students at home, and how we can use this PRISM model to explain why that's so critical. Sandra noted that the PRISM model could be used in a grade level PLC. She said, as an administrator, she likes to listen to teachers who are working on standard 4 about being reflective about their teaching, and also how they have English learners in their classes and what they're doing to address their needs. And she said all of her teachers have English learners, so that's something that she always focuses on. Emily Long, the other Emily on the line today, also has some comments to share. Emily, go ahead.
I was just saying that just reading about the social and cultural processes, I'm watching a friendship bloom among one of my English learners and one of my native English learners, and my EL student's birthday was this week, and she was talking about the things that they do. Well, you know, in our culture, you know, we have sleepovers and, you know, the parents meet each other, and my EL learner looked at, because I asked her, I said, so what are you going to do for your birthday? And she goes, well, I can't have anybody come over to my house. And I was like, oh, okay. You know, I didn't ask any more questions because I've learned sometimes you just don't want to ask. And my other student, that's her friend, was kind of like, taken aback, and she was like, well, why? And she said, because my mom and dad don't let other people come over to our house unless you're family. So then it just kind of went into a huge discussion about culture and how, you know, that's what her family believes. And then her friend, you know, this friendship that is blooming, it was like, oh, because, you know, we have kids, you know, we have friends come over all the time. And so we had to get into a discussion about, you know, it's not wrong what her family is teaching her, and it's not wrong what your family is teaching, but that's the difference between our cultures. So just learning and respecting these cultures and letting the kids know about cultures that not everybody thinks the same, I think is huge for these kids, that it's okay of what they're doing. And it's, you know, it's nothing's wrong with it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, especially when we think about the PRISM model and those social and cultural processes. That what you just described is an incredible learning opportunity for all the students involved to know that some cultures view, you know, outsiders or strangers a little bit differently than others do, especially when it comes to even things that we are very accustomed to, like inviting someone over for a birthday party or some sort of a social engagement like that. Sometimes families are very protective and they have very specific reasons culturally why that is. So it's a good opportunity to do a lot of learning, but also to help them build understanding. And like you said, to help them understand that this is not good or bad. It is just different than how others do it.
Yep. And the kids were like, oh, and then it led into discussion about other things that they do differently in their house and why some families do some things and some families do others. I mean, it was awesome because we had a group of 4 and it was like, they were like, oh, and so, I mean, it was a really good discussion.
Excellent. That sounds like a lot of great learning experience for everyone.
It was.
Good. All right, we have just a few more comments. We actually had a question about that. Another person said that sounded like a great discussion that you just described. How old were the students you were talking about?
They were 5th graders.
Yeah, okay, very good. All right. Sandra added that learners' portraits that are written collectively are a great source for reflection on these different dimensions, and maybe would get at some of the things you just described if they were sort of self-portraits, if you were, that were shared with the classroom. All right. Well, thank you for that. Again, I'm conscious of our time, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll us forward a bit. We've kind of talked about this, but let's just think about it real quickly. How do the state standards and or the district and school curriculum that's written on the state standards encourage cognitive development, as evident in the rigor and expectations of English learners compared to native English speakers? So that cognitive development component is something we haven't talked a lot about, but let's focus in on that. So how do our state standards or our district and school curriculum reflect that? Go ahead and type in your response, or just let me know you want to speak out, and I can unmute you to share. All right, Christina, I'll go ahead and unmute you so you can share.
I don't really have much more to offer than that. I was just thinking about, you know, in terms of cognitive development in line with the standards, that the biggest thing I'm learning is, the scaffolds that are created that allow ELs to access the rigor. So instead of, and we do that in special ed as well with interventions and specially designed instruction, is just not dumbing down the curriculum, allowing them to still think through the processes within their own abilities and what they can do, but doing it in a way that they can actually access, because obviously, they can't access it like everyone else if they're not, in that same, with those same language abilities.
Good point. Gabriella, I'll go ahead and unmute you so you can share.
I think for me it's a struggle because I feel like the rigor and the expectations, I mean, they're good, but at the same time, the time and basically the time that these students are given is not enough. Like, I feel like we're always rushing when these kids, you need to slow down and you need to provide that time for them to master a lot of skills. I also struggle with, things like reading at home every day. Like, some of these kids are not reading at home every day, and if they are, they're not getting that support. So there are some things that that I struggle with in terms of how much are the needs and the the needs of these students are taken into consideration when they want them to meet the expectations of what they're supposed to be mastering. So that's something that I struggle, that you have, it's like a race. It's like you're always rushing, and these kids need time and time. So that's a difficult question for me.
I think it's a hard question for everybody, and you're right. Time is certainly an element that we can't control, but we also don't want to control us, and so it's a struggle.
And they need it, and then it's like, where do you get the time to really provide and differentiate and give them the tools that they need to get to where they need to be? Because you do want that rigor, you want high expectations, but at the same time, that it takes time. Language acquisition takes time, and the expectation of growth within 1 year doesn't match the natural processing time of acquiring a language.
We've got several people saying in the question box that you are definitely on point in saying that time is critical, and just in the research we're looking at in this book and this book study together, clearly we see the time it takes for our English learners to make that 1 year of growth as compared to native English speakers.
And I see a lot of growth, and that's something that is sad, because you're always seeing them grow. They are growing, they're learning, but they're not meeting they're growing, but they're not meeting proficiency. So it's like they're not being proficient, but the growth that they're making is not enough, and then the gap gets wider, because then the growth needs to be a lot bigger for them to meet proficiency. And it's like, when am I gonna get to that proficiency goal when the expectation is a little bit too high, or the time? Maybe the expectation is not high, but it's the time that we have and that the students have to get to that point.
Yeah, definitely. Claire also has some things to add. So Claire, I'll unmute you to share. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had written that, the question, how did the state or district curriculum, the standards or curriculum, encourage development and rigor in our Ls? And unfortunately, the curriculum doesn't often take into consideration the Ls. But the good news is, in Durham, we are working on the new curriculum now, and so there's a group of us of ESL teachers that were allowed to participate and help add in some supports for Ls in the curriculum. that's coming up.
So things are changing. And that's good to think of too. You know, there's a famous quote about how when you know better, you do better. And that I think speaks to all of us when we think about the experience we gain over time as educators and the things we learn regarding the research for all of our students. And so we're learning this research about English learners and thinking about then how should that change things like our local curriculum? How does that impact how we do instruction? All right, and Marcella, you have a comment as well. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm there. So about the rigor that our districts have for our language learners, I don't think they realize that our families, many of them don't have the skills, don't have the means, don't have the time to help the students at home, while the native speakers like have being able to speak the language is a huge advantage already, you know. Also, they tend to forget. I don't know if it's really forget, and they wish that acquiring the second language was like done magically over a couple months, when we all know that acquiring a second language takes years to master. And many of us as second language learners are still learning every day, you know, even if it's just some words, that's learning. So I don't think they are realistic when it comes to rigor, because they fail to take into account all these other things.
And there's several people in the question box saying they agree with you. Sandra said that she absolutely agrees with you. And Carlos and Sarah have actually added some other comments to that go along with what you're saying. Carlos said that one of the main issues is standardized testing. You know, the rigor is there, but both ESL and mainstream teachers are doing their jobs. But in the end, the expectation is based on that standardized test and so forth. And so sometimes that's an additional pressure that doesn't help in doing things the way we know they need to be done for our English learners. And then Sarah added too that, you know, there's a great deal of pressure at the local level to show almost impossible growth, getting back this idea of how long does it take to close the gap for English learners when we think about how that's measured on standardized tests. And so that kind of pressure is passed on to students and produces frustration, of course. How could it not? And Sandra goes on to say she understands the growth expectation, but she wonders how this affects the social and emotional dimensions of the PRISM model, and that it worries her a little bit how that plays out with each individual student. Gabriella noted that she agrees with what's been said, and she's glad to see that everyone is kind of seeing that and thinking about that now. That will help us as we go forward. And finally, our last comment on the rigor and so forth, Kimberly says the state standards well address the rigor and cognitive development of the average native English speaking student. But sometimes we have to go sort of beyond that to consider the cognitive, social, and other needs of students who are different than the average student. And that is something to consider how we do that. All right. Well, I'd like to finish up today by asking you to put in the question box any additional questions or thoughts you have about the content from Chapter 4, or obviously Module 6 that it was in, that you'd like to share with the group. What else have we not talked about from Chapter 4 that would be important to mention to inform our thinking as we continue to read? And while we're doing that, I'll go ahead and also do the poll question, which is hopefully will help you with that thinking, which is what next steps will you take based on the chapter or the module, the Chapter 4 or Module 6 that we looked at. And so will you dig deeper into the chapter or module? Will you analyze the English learner legislation more closely? Will you analyze the English learner data you have to determine your next steps? Will you initiate discussion among your colleagues, or will you advocate for changes? And of course, like with many of our poll questions, these are check all that apply, so you may have more than one thing in mind, and that's great too. Go ahead and check that off and then add anything in the box in addition that we want to think about with Chapter 4. All right, go ahead and putting it in your responses to this poll question. We'll close it out here in a few seconds. All right, thank you for that. I'm gonna go ahead and close that. And then of course, share the results with you. So we have the majority of people, a big majority, 77% saying they will go ahead and initiate discussion among colleagues about what they've learned in Chapter 4. And almost the same number who said they're going to dig more deeply into the chapter or the module resources that are there about the topics in the chapter to learn more. We have 64% of you on the line today who said you will either analyze the English learner data you have to determine next steps, or you'll advocate for changes that are needed. And a little over 40% of you said you were going to analyze the English learner legislation more closely. So that's good to know. All right, let's go back then to our question about what else are you thinking with Chapter 4? And I'll just kind of read across some of the main comments so we can all be thinking about them. We have several people talking about how much they enjoyed this chapter, how they learned a lot from it. They liked things like learning about the additive and subtractive bilingualism model and how that impacts students. We also have someone who said they really enjoyed reading this chapter because it opened up ways to address the gap between English learners and native English speakers, as well as how to educate the whole child using the PRISM model as a guide. Several people are talking about the things that are happening in their schools to make a difference for English learners. One person said they want to make sure their school leaders and teachers all have this information about the PRISM model and the things from Chapter 4. And one person offered that that things are changing lately with administrators who want classroom teachers to learn how to work with English learners in a better fashion. So, for example, the district is really investing in everyone training in the SIOP model in order to help English learners. This person says the research around the question of how much time made a lot of sense to him because it brings out all those things that as a professional we've always wondered but could not find the words to describe. So things that you know are there but you can identify. And so this was totally an eye-opener to have this in front of them in a book. He says he's glad North Carolina is giving room through this book study to present an essential missing component of our system. So it's good to know. There's several people also saying they enjoyed reading the book and generally enjoyed our discussion today, so that's good to hear. We do have a question too, is there a newer version of the PRISM model or any changes to it? And the only answer I have to that right now is I don't think so, but that's something we could ask about. Or we could even think about if we were to make a newer version of the PRISM model or make changes, what would they be? And why would we want to make those? How would that better help our students in thinking about their needs? All right, well, as we finish out today, I wanted to make sure that we had the information we needed to go forward. Several people have asked about some grading with the Canvas course. So I wanted to go over a few things just briefly. As you know, we have a 1 CEU section and a 2 CEU section. Everyone's doing the same things when it comes to our synchronous sessions like this and our discussions, which again have been really good today. But when it comes to the 2 CEU section, of course, they are doing a few more assignments like the chapter reading quizzes, which are automatically scored in Canvas. And so that grade is automatically posted once they complete the quiz. Those quizzes are 10 points each. And then they also do some reflection responses in discussion forums. Just so you know, we are catching up on grading. That week off helped us as well, Ivana and I, as your instructors. And so we just want to remind everyone that grading the synchronous sessions means that there are 10 points possible each time. When you participate live in the broadcast, like you're doing right here, you earn 8 out of 10 points. If you attend and participate in the polls, you earn 9 out of 10. And if you attend, participate in the polls, and add to our discussion, which so many of you have today, you earn a total of 10 points out of 10. That gets automatically posted, so you don't have to worry about that. If you do miss a live broadcast and you're listening to this recording because of that, you need to view the recording that's posted on our syllabus and then complete the assignment below to earn your points, your 10 points for the synchronous session. So you can see that assignment posted there. Write a post describing the 3 most interesting points from the synchronous session broadcast and share why you believe those points are interesting and how they helped your learning as an educator. So that's for the synchronous sessions that everyone is involved in, whether you're in the 1 CEU section or 2 CEU section. Then when we talk about grading discussions, you know that for our discussion forum postings, for the visual introductions that we've already done in each section, as well as for the reflection responses and the reflections from the field assignment at the end that our 2 CEU section earners have, this is the rubric that we use. Now this rubric is also visible in our Canvas course. All you have to do is click on the upper right-hand corner of that assignment for your discussion forum and that rubric will appear. But just so you know, we are scoring on the timeliness of submission, the quality of the post, and the responses for peers. So this is a good opportunity to remind everyone, especially if you're in the 2 CEU section, that you should take some time to respond to your peers and see what they posted. Not only is it good reading, much like our conversations here during our synchronous sessions are good discussions to have, but also you'll see kind of things from other people's perspectives, and as you respond, you help build their score on the rubric because some of those responses and how thought-provoking they are important too. So as you respond to people, what you're sharing back with them is also part of your grade on those discussion forum postings or reflections. Don't forget that this book study is part of a whole series. There will be 5 of these book studies eventually. We'll always have an instructor-led version like we're having here, as well as a self-paced version after we finish this that will be released statewide and also in Canvas Commons so that anyone, whether you're part of the North Carolina system and can access it in our statewide system, or you're outside of that in some fashion, or maybe want to download a copy of this for your local use, you can have that access in Canvas Commons. So maximum flexibility when it comes to accessing the tools we're putting together for these book studies. All right, that's the end of our broadcast today. Just some reminders. Next week, we'll be talking about modules 7 and 8 or chapters 5 and 6. I heard several of you say that the reading we've been doing has really inspired you to go ahead and continue on and forge ahead. So some of you have your reading done already. Be sure that you get all that reading done by next Tuesday, November 5th, when we have our next synchronous session. And then those of you who are in the 2 CEU section can do the quizzes for those chapters and the discussion forum postings. You're always welcome to contact Ivana or I about any questions you have. And I did see a couple of questions from folks in the question box and in our Canvas online platform that I will also get to today or tomorrow. So those answers are coming, but you're always welcome to contact us with any individual questions you have. Oh, and I see before we close out, someone is asking, are the next sections of assignments going to open soon? They are indeed going to open today, later today, so please be ready for that. I know we opened through chapter 4, and we need to go ahead and open up the other sections. So we will go ahead and open up through chapter 8, which is of course the end of the book, so you can work ahead and work at the pace you need to for what's best for you. All right. With that, I thank you for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion and learning from each other, and I hope you're looking forward to next week's conversation as well.